Chicago, Nina, where the DNC is making the city very busy. So
Yeah, I have a really, really good friend that's there. I think she's got some tickets she was able to score tonight. So she's having a big night out with the DNC.
yeah, yeah, no, so it's interesting around these parts right now. But all right, well, as folks join us here, welcome to the goodparty.org AMA series that we're doing. Super excited to welcome our guest shortly here. Hi, folks that are joining. Hello. So really excited to have a great conversation with Nina today and dive into the work that she and her organization are doing. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. For folks who are new to the format here, we'll have Nina introduce herself in a moment, talk about her organization, and then we've had some pre-submitted questions that came through. So I've got a bunch of great Ask Me Anythings to really get into the great work that they're doing and some of the curiosities that folks in our Discord community had. If you are watching this on a social platform, you can also put questions in the chat. And if we have time after the pre-submitted questions, then Quinn, who's monitoring all of those, will do his best to ferry them back to us. And if you're here with us on Zoom, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. And again, once we get through the pre-submitted ones, I'll do my best to work those in. So super excited to have Nina here. And just as we dive in, I'll just say I'm Victoria P. Mitchell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at goodparty.org. We've been hosting these, monthly series for about 6 months now, just highlighting awesome people doing democracy reform work in our community. So super excited to introduce Nina Taylor. Nina, if you don't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Oh, I can certainly do that. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be chatting with the good people of Good Party. As Victoria mentioned, my name is Nina Taylor. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. As a background for me, I am born and raised in Washington, D.C. And so if you're familiar with this area, they kind of dump politics into the water. And so everybody always asks, like, when did you get your start? And I think it was the first time my dad said, Reagan's going to put us in the poorhouse. And I'm like, who is Reagan and why do we have to go to the poorhouse? And so it was kind of a baptism by fire. I spent most of my career in nonprofits, mostly with medical specialty societies, working with educating some of the brilliant minds of our physicians, primarily infectious diseases and oncology. And then on the side, because I just had so much free time, I worked as an advisor for a number of directors of legislative affairs. I've worked with campaigns as a fundraiser and an organizer. And so as I kind of take a look at my career, I think where I am with CES is a culmination of all of those experiences and all of those fire drills. And I think some of the excitement, that we're seeing in our democracy. And I think that call for action to change, right? And so I think we're kind of at that fever pitch now as we're kind of moving through the generations and really even evaluating what leadership looks like at all levels, right? Like whether it's at your jobs or with your elected officials. And so I'm really excited to be joining the team with CES. I started at the top of the year. And the Center for Election Science has been around since 2011. So the focus of the organization is research and education, and then we advocate and lobby in support of voting reform, specifically approval voting. And so a lot of our work goes into taking a look at everything from voter expression to what happens with particular reforms when they are implemented and kind of taking those data insights and moving it to action, right? And so having conversations with our legislators and with our advocates and nonprofit organizations to really get us to a place where we feel like democracy works for us all.
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. And I didn't realize it was as old as 2011, so I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that journey to when approval voting really became kind of the focus. And we'll talk a fair bit about approval voting, today for folks who don't know about it. But was that, my understanding was the Center for Election Science in general was like, let's take a data-based approach, let's research, let's study what's going on in the space and kind of be the organization in the wider space that's like doing that deeper insight work. So I assume that was like the first chapter, and obviously continues to be something important. And then where did the approval voting piece come in? You know, when was that?
Yeah. So while the organization has been around for since 2011, when we come to like reform, we're technically kind of still like the new kids on the block, right? And so approval voting is adopted in Fargo, North Dakota, as well as St. Louis, Missouri. And we've got legislation that we entered into the state of Maryland last legislative session. And then we'll be reintroducing it again. And we've had campaigns in Seattle. We have movement in Utah, and so it really started out very much, as you said, research focused, and then grassroots, right? So as people were educated that they can change the way in which we cast a ballot, and that there are alternatives out there, and then they started looking at the alternatives. That's kind of where CES met at the crossroads, and so through that data, there were 7 key factors that CES looked at through their many years of research and analysis that makes for a good reform, right? And so making sure it's clear and accessible in terms of the voting process, that the results are prompt, right? So you're not waiting a week, for results, right? So that gets to like the mistrust of elections. And importantly, that they're accurate, that it's fair, it's representative, and from our elections administrator's perspective, that it's cost compatible with the state, with the district. And so the other parameters that we look at is like that hyper-partisan, like removing some of that polarization that we're seeing. And, I think bringing back to the voter how powerful your vote is. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is the impacts of vote splitting, and what vote splitting has done to our elections, and what it's done to even how people campaign, and I think how voters feel about casting their ballot. And so we talk quite a bit about vote splitting and how things like approval voting can help mitigate what we've seen across the country with vote splitting in our elections.
Yeah, I might work in a question here actually that I was going to save for later, but it fits here. Obviously we're, focused on the independent, alternative party and nonpartisan space, so vote splitting is definitely a top, concern and challenge in our world. And I think a related question, actually Quinn threw this one in is, what are the main benefits of approval voting, especially in terms of reducing the spoiler effect in elections? Vote splitting is connected but separate from the spoiler effect. So just curious to hear you talk more about that to this group of people who cares about that issue.
For sure. So there's a couple of, I think, terms that when we talk about approval voting, we kind of immediately go to where the
actually let's pause and what is approval voting? Let's lay that out and then we'll come back. I was like, wait a second, we got to cover that.
So approval voting is a very simple reform. And so really it is, you have your ballot, you're able to select every candidate that you approve of. So you don't have to just select one candidate. So, it really kind of runs on consensus. And then all of those approvals are tallied. So it's simple math. And then the candidate with the most approvals wins. Right. And so we've seen this work just on its own, approval voting, possibly as a first step to the top 2 kind of having the one-to-one competition. But it's a super simple reform. It's similar to what you might do for school board with multiple seats. I think it also helps not only with that kind of hyper partisanship, but allowing candidates that opportunity to run and get consensus, right? So they can't play the map. They have to come to your neighborhood and speak to the issues that are most important to you, right? And so you're not ignored in an approval voting method because they have to vie for your vote. And so we say that it's like one candidate, one vote. And you're, again, able to select all of the folks that you approve of and none of the ones that you do not. From our elections administrators' perspective, they have been working with us not only in educating broadly about approval voting, but the fact that it can be used on the current voting machines, right? So there's a cost reduction there. Again, with that auditing and tallying, it's super simple. And so that's something that is a big benefit. And then that voter burden, right? So we're seeing a lot of campaigns now and like races that have like 8, 9, 10 individuals running. And I think to this question about ranked choice voting, one of those things is really that burden on the voter to educate yourself about 8, 9, 10 candidates to be able to rank them, right? And so what we've seen in some of our polling is that most people have someone that they really, really approve of, that they think would do a great job representing them in whatever seat that they're running for. And they also have another one that they like, that they think that they might do a good job. And so you're able to vote for both of those folks with approval voting. And I think that not only does that help independents that are running and folks that are, I think, in a case of Maryland, independent voters, they don't have the opportunity to actually vote in primaries, right? And so, it's you're paying the taxes and you don't actually, have the opportunity to have a say. And so, approval voting comes in and a lot of that is mitigated.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chat a bit about ranked choice voting. And so
before you do that, just to make sure
yeah.
I got approval voting, and then we'll layer in ranked choice voting, which some folks are aware of, some folks are not. So just to reiterate, make sure I've got it. Approval voting, I have my ballot and I say, oh, I approve of this candidate. I also approve of that candidate. I'm not going to approve of these other 1, 2, 3, however many are on the ballot. So right. I have, 2 approvals. Let's say you're also voting in the same election, Nina, let's say you have 3 approvals because you're open to 3 of the, let's say 4 candidates. Then when the votes get tallied, it's ultimately just who has the most approvals total,
That's
right? Okay.
Yeah. And you end up with these higher percentages of approval, right? Because it's consensus. So we're seeing folks with like 70% of the vote or, 68% rather than what you end up seeing with vote splitting, where a candidate will squeeze by with 23% of the vote, right? So that's not a mandate from the community to lead or to govern. And so that's one of those things where, it goes back to, do you believe that my vote counts? Should I, get off of work to go cast a ballot if this person can squeak by with just very small margins?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting too how the language reflects approval ratings, which is something we hear, usually it's at the national level. You don't tend to do approval surveys at the local level as an example, but going in, oh, this candidate who won had 65% approval of their district. And then, when their reelection comes, or if they happen to get some kind of approval polling throughout their term, you can kind of almost track it back to how were they when they came in the door, so that's interesting. Yeah. Well, then let's layer in the ranked choice voting piece too, because I know that's a question, folks out there may have heard of ranked choice voting. Some folks, if you're really in the world, might have heard of Final 4 voting or Final 5 voting. There's star voting. There's a lot of different reforms out there. And, there's a lot of, discussion in our space, but ranked choice voting is the one that people tend to have heard of the most. So we'll stick with that one. But yeah, Kiani asked, about how does this compare to ranked choice voting for those who are in the know about that?
Yeah, so I would say that in the voting reform space, we are cousins, but we're the younger, cooler cousin. I would have to say that. So ranked choice voting is just another voting reform method, right? And so we're all against plurality, which is the way in which we cast the ballot now. Like we just know that the current system just does not work. And so everybody has their banner for their own reform. Ranked choice voting was able to kind of get out in front of the other reforms, raise money, have media and legislators that they were able to educate prior to anyone like SCORE or Approval or STAR. And so they've been out ahead since I think early
90s. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, so there's this difference between having data about ranked choice voting in practice and having folks actually being able to use RCV in practice. And so, if you're in New York, if you're in Alaska, if you're in California, you've had an opportunity to try RCV. Why we advocate for approval voting is there's a couple of issues with RCV, right? So one is around the education when it comes to the voters and the difficulty it is for the election administrators. And so I typically ask folks to explain to me how you believe a ranked choice ballot is scored, right? And so you end up having conversations around exhausted ballots. in New York, you actually saw boroughs, especially minority communities, that ended up not filling in the ranked choice ballot correctly. And so there wasn't time to cure those ballots. And so a lot of that got thrown out. And then it's the multiple rounds, right? And so there's this opacity to being able to tally and really know that like my vote actually counted, right? So there's some issues with that. When it comes down to the candidate itself, we've seen situations where candidates would tell voters, rank me first and second, right? Which you can't do. And so there was some education hurdles there. And it's the cost as well, and the expense, I think, from the administrator side, and then that inability to truly do an audit very quickly. When it comes to approval voting, we've seen implementation of approval voting for communities as low as $1,000. And a lot of that money went to educating voters, right? So getting the information into the voters pamphlet. And so again, there are ways in which we compare because we are another reform. But I personally feel and professionally feel like for a lot of places, the first big step to making some changes would be approval voting, right? So we have a study that we're currently running on kind of cognitive burden for the voter to be able to educate themselves on these crowded fields, to be able to rank candidates. And then do they understand how that vote is tallied, right? And so we're kind of seeing some disconnects there.
Yep, that's helpful. Yeah, and I'm curious too, how do you determine like which method of voting is the right one to push it for in a community? And like you said, there's cousins out there, right, of these different voting reform methods. I think, we all are pulling in the same direction of wanting a more competitive democracy where our votes matter and higher voter participation, all the vision is aligned. It's just the way we get there. But any thoughts on like, is my community better to push ranked choice or push approval or push Final Four? Like, how do you see that world?
Yeah, I really love that question, only because it kind of gets to where we are, right? This intersection of status quo and like civic innovation, right? And so it's really hard to have innovation in a platform or a foundation that didn't actually think in that way, right? So when democracy was created, do you think that they logged on to TikTok to campaign, right? And so it's like, and so in some ways we have to kind of take some of that old way of thinking and just put it to the side and think of what could be new on the horizon and like what makes sense for our community. There are some communities where if you're an independent, you have to have more signatures than if you were in being a Republican or a Democrat, right? Is that fair, right? If there are now, in order to run, you have to have thousands, if not millions of dollars. If you're running for Senate, millions of dollars, right? And so is that accessible for the everyman? No, right? You see this gaming that happens where folks might run people from the same demographic to split that, to split the votes, or running name recognition, right? And so, how it makes a big difference in those communities. And so you kind of have to think about those things, right? And all of the variables that are in play within your municipality, and then taking a look at the voting laws, right? And so some of the first steps could be just enacting legislation that allows you to take a look at alternative voting methods. Some you can go, pure ballot initiative, and the community can bring forth the fact that we want to pilot a particular reform, which I think is particularly effective because we can take information from in practice and then being able to educate our legislators about it. But there are multiple pathways to make it happen and really kind of understand, what is important to that community. We're all about consensus, and we don't see an issue when implementing approval voting in communities, especially those that have been hyperpartisan, or the districts had been, the lines have been redrawn. And so a lot of, I think, some of those issues that we're seeing, things like approval voting can help. If you're really curious about approval voting, I encourage you to reach out to us. We're at electionscience.org. We'd love to have a conversation and being able to kind of come up with a battle plan. Some of our strongest allies, especially in Missouri, came from folks that just saw that there needed to be change, or somebody that they really, really approved of lost a race because of the impacts of vote splitting and wanted to do something about it, right? And I think that's part of moving civic innovations, having that participation in it.
Yeah, no, that's a good segue actually to the spoiler effect, and which we kind of came off of earlier when we realized we need to break it down. And then I think a related question from Rob is how has approval voting, or how does it help independent, third party, truly nonpartisan candidates, and how does that play in? So would love to hear your thoughts on those two issues.
Yeah, so for me as an educator, I think it's always important to kind of lay a foundation, right? So as an independent voter or an unaffiliated voter, right, we're seeing kind of that increase happen, especially as we're starting to shift from generations that had been in leadership under a system that kind of worked for them, but not really, to a generation that's like, this don't work, right? And so there's an uphill battle. So there's a funding battle. There is the media battle that you all have. The fact that independents are often labeled spoilers, right? And so, but you have quality candidates that represent interests that aren't part of kind of a hyper partisan kind of politics. And so there's a shift that needs to happen. I think a low hanging fruit is things like approval voting, right? If you take a look at voting reform and how candidates run, and being able to get broad support and not having those barriers to having to have double, in some cases triple the signatures in a community, right? While also not being able to knock on doors or have flyers because it's just so expensive to run. That you need some sort of support to, I think, balance out the playing ground. The other piece of that is that you're seeing this, we're going to be doing a study with Gallup on young voters. And, independent voters aren't a monolith, right? And so you have this next generation that's kind of coming in, you're overlapping, really their ideology. So like Christianity, some of them aren't, right? Like they're spiritual, they're not. The age, a lot of the information that we have in terms of research comes from college students. Well, what about those that didn't go to college or trades, right? And so there is this big knowledge gap. Where are they getting information related to their candidates? And how do they feel about participating in elections? And so we're going to be kind of digging into that. When it comes to, and I just had a conversation last week with the Independent Center, when it comes to candidates running and folks like Forward Party, or we kind of have a breakdown on our website about Andrew Yang running, right? And it really turned into this focus about the issues, right? And that's kind of what we want out of our politics, not the tribalism, but like, do I connect with this particular person on the issues, and do their policies have merit, right? Can they carry in my community, and do they speak to what I'm most passionate about? And so we look at approval voting as a way to not only have independents run, but usually we kind of did this focus group in Ohio. And it was just interesting, out of the slate where, and we did the presidential candidates, where independents fell, right? And so being able to, I think, really have a true shot, because I think independents have kind of always ran on a consensus, right? And so, having, I think, a true shot to being able to win and being able to lead, right? And so that's, I think, one of those things that as we, take a look at reforming the system, that these voices are included in that.
Yeah, no, you named a lot of things that are super important in our space, that I think, that's part of the point of our organization, is to drive the cost of running for office down. It shouldn't be so expensive to run for office. And so we're making as much of that free as we possibly can, and voter data at $10 a month, since we got to charge for that, given the the way the election compliance works, but we want to make it as accessible as possible for people to do that so that it's not a barrier, which historically for independents, it has been a big barrier because you don't
Yeah.
have the fundraising machine of the local or state, Democratic or Republican Party.
Yeah.
And then the other piece I want to just double click on too is, it's exciting. These voting reforms are so helpful to give a leg up. And I think you'll be, I think folks watching will be excited to hear too, we're just actually passed yesterday 2,000 local and state candidates running for office as independents and nonpartisans who are connected with goodparty.org. And we're adding over 200 a week right now. It's just
Yeah.
stacking so fast. And so far this year, if you have approval voting, if you have ranked choice, I think it makes it easier. But even in a plurality first past the post system, which is the vast majority of these candidates who have already had elections this year, our overall win rate for the year is 39%, so
Yeah.
they're winning, right? And things like approval voting is just going to make it easier, right, for folks to do it versus the uphill battle that we're often facing, but still, finding success in, thankfully. So it's exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it is an exciting time, especially as we take a look at that next generation of candidates that run. And, they have seen and kind of the hyper partisanship and how that's kind of gridlocked progress, right? And so, even down to not passing any legislation outside of financial legislation that you have to because of all the infighting, right? And so they haven't been able to see a world in which all of these parties like work together for the common good, right? It really did turn tribal, and so it'll be really interesting the next few years. I'm saying 15 years before we really are able to flip things over, but we know now that it just doesn't work the way that the system currently is set up.
Yeah, no, I think we can do it faster, but I might be aggressive.
Yeah.
But I think it's, to your point earlier, and I'm super curious to see the Gallup, study work that you're doing. I mean, we already know the majority of, young people, millennials and Gen Z identify as independent / don't identify with either of the major two parties. And it was, I think, Pew recently who found that now the majority of Americans, regardless of age, are now identifying as independent. So, to your point, I think the independent-minded person, is typically more open to doing things differently because they see the system isn't serving them, and may have varying degrees of understanding why. But things like approval voting, these voting reform initiatives, right, I think speak to, folks who feel disenfranchised by the current system and, are not seeing candidates that reflect, what they want to see in office at their local and state level. So, and to that end, I'll kind of layer in another question here from Rob about what impacts are we seeing on diversity of candidates in places with approval voting?
Yeah, so I would love to share kind of one of our case studies. It really speaks to not only diversity, but I think the quality of the candidates. So we take a look at St. Louis, and so St. Louis has a very famous street called Delmar. Locals call it the Delmar Divide, but it's North St. Louis, which is predominantly African American. And the southern part of St. Louis is predominantly white and affluent, right? And so the way that their plurality elections, it kind of teeter-tottered on control, right? And so you ended up with, very small margins of folks, 20%, 30% winning, and then the other side getting shut out, right? And so mostly it was the African American communities that were shut out, multiple barriers that existed there, whether it was fundraising, or what we call like stacking kind of like the ticket. So you ended up with 5 or 6 African Americans running from the same community, and then you had 1 or 2 white candidates, and then all of the Black voters split up the vote between all of the Black candidates that were running. And in some cases, I've even seen things as far as like running similar names and the name recognition piece. And so we were able to implement approval voting after the community raised their hand and said, there has to be another way. And so a coalition was built on the ground that involved the League of Women Voters, St. Louis Approves, I believe that we also had SEIU and legislators that were able to really grasp kind of the community's growing concern and disdain for the voting system to enact approval voting. And so in 2017, you ended up with a slate, and this is for their mayor race, where you had 5 candidates. 4 candidates were Black, and then Lyda Krewson won with 32% of the vote, who was a white woman. Tashira Jones ended up getting 30% of the vote, so she was right there on the edge. And then you had Lewis Reed, Antonio French, and Jeffrey Boyd that kind of split up the vote a little over 30%. So then they were able to enact approval voting. And so in their 2021 election, you ended up seeing Lyda Krewson not even run, right? And then Tashira Jones ended up winning with 57% of the vote, and Kara Spencer with 46% of the vote. What's interesting about this, and this is where I'm going to go into full data nerds for a moment, so please excuse me, but it was the heat map for Tashira Jones. She was able to gain support on that north side of the Del Mar Divide, but also really huge pockets on that south side, right? And so that campaign looked different, that reach looked different. And having that large approval means that she was able to go into into that job, right, that elected job, and had that mandate from the community to lead, being able to do things on the first 60 days that the community had been asking for decades, right? And so we love that case study. We actually went back to St. Louis voters to see how they really liked an approval voting method, and overwhelmingly 70+% of voters really enjoy being able to vote in an approval voting method. It doesn't hurt the candidates. They are able to support that consensus candidate that they like. And we can see this play out as a way to not only mitigate kind of those vote splitting, but things like gerrymandering, right? We were having conversations while we were testifying, and ACLU was working in Baltimore, and they redrawn the lines for Baltimore, right? And so people that were living in a particular apartment complex that had always voted for the city now has to vote in the county, right? And so imagine doing something for 15, 20 years, and then now having to kind of vote for someone in the county that doesn't look like you, that doesn't come from your community or reflect your values. And so again, we introduced approval voting, and that's one of the reasons why we are really focused in on Maryland moving forward. But we're looking to publish more of these case studies and more data as we have approval voting enacted in multiple states and municipalities, and we're looking forward to seeing what it can do.
That's great. I think a related question to what you were just sharing from Sal was, can you share any insights or data, so this is a fellow data nerd, on how approval voting has affected voter engagement and turnout in the cities where it's been implemented? So you just shared they like it after the fact, but how has it affected engagement and turnout?
Yeah, and so this is a super interesting question because that research is still ongoing, right? And I think what's also worth saying is that voters come out based on candidates, right? Based on the issues on the ballots, and not necessarily the voting method itself, right? So that's going to be kind of like that one check mark that we'll be looking at. But there is this sense that we can see with some of the data that we've been able to collect, out of St. Louis, out of Fargo. We did a focus group in Ohio. We pulled folks in Michigan as well as Maryland, that it's almost primed right now for voting reform. It's at the top of people's minds, like as they are introduced to different methods and kind of grasp it, they can see how it would really work in practice. And I think that as we expand, I think we can get more into voter expression and let's get out, how do we kind of look at get out to vote, right? And so that's one of the things I think we can look at in the future. But again, that's research that's worth doing, but ongoing.
Yeah. And then I'm going to layer in Kiani's question as well here. How do you think we can overcome the hurdles for states that are dominated by a single party or often uncontested seats from a single party? Mentions Massachusetts, where you often have only one name on the ballot. And, I keep a close eye on this data. Ballotpedia reports on uncontested elections regularly. They update their numbers every month. And I just had it yesterday. I think it was up to 73%, if I'm not wrong now. It's, historically reports, 70%, but yeah, 73% so far this year of elections that have happened have been uncontested. So yeah, what are those dynamics like in the single party dominated states? And then, often those are also heavily uncontested, seats and states as well.
So CES, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit. And so we've had the benefit of working literally across the aisle. And so, when I see your question around hurdles, I think the first hurdle is, from the voter perspective, that you can change the way in which you cast your ballot. That's actually a number one hurdle, right? So once we get there, what are the reforms that actually can be enacted? The other piece, and I think now because things are shifting, even in those dominated states, party dominated states, there are still these issues that crop up, right? So from the Democrats, we talk a lot about vote splitting. On Republican side, we talk about polarization and control of the party. And then on the independent side, we talk about a shot, right? Like, having that opportunity to kind of run and not think about this in terms of a top of a ticket. Everybody's been receptive because no party is perfect. And there are these, I think, issues that even the dominated single party they're interested in working out. It's just not the same playbook for them all because, they look at these issues in a very different way. And so, especially having a dominated single party, uncontested seats without voter engagement and without, the ability to say, like, there are these opportunities that you can, not only run and run successfully without the financial barriers. I think that there's just a lot more work that we need to do. But I believe now that having the conversation, introducing approval voting, and getting an audience with the legislators is important. And they're listening now, right? And so quite a few of them have already heard about RCV. They know about some of the challenges. And so, it's, again, being able to entertain that space with them and talk about approval voting or whatever other reform you want to adopt. But they're listening now.
Yeah, that's good. You're doing the hard work of getting in front of them because, historically, the parties tend to fear change. It's like, I know how to win with this playbook. Don't change the playbook on me, right? Because then we don't know how to run. But, I think, go ahead.
You see how that played out, at the top of the ticket this year, right? And so, with our poll in Ohio, our focus group, we actually did approval voting. We gave them the slate of presidential hopefuls, and Donald Trump actually was like fourth, right? DeSantis actually came out on top, in Ohio, and then you end up, with the party, and you see the top of the ticket, and you have some folks that are overwhelmingly underwhelmed, right? And then on the other side, you have now the DNC that I think young voters infused a lot of excitement into it, but there were some issues and some bumps along the way, right? And so I think there's this disruption of the status quo, or this is how it's always been. And now is the time to really, I think, introduce not only this really clear civic innovation, but the fact that, we can't keep casting a ballot like we did for Lincoln, when we're future focused, right? And so it's time to make some meaningful changes.
Yep, and I'll just give my own plug for uncontested. That's actually a good thing for us in the independent and alternative party and nonpartisan space, because while we're stuck with, first past the post systems, if it's an uncontested seat and you can be that other candidate contesting, well, it's still a two-way race. So the spoiler effect, et cetera, all that, the effects of that go down, and it's not the argument that sometimes people can make it out to be, right? So it's, I think that's up to our movement to contest those races, because having 73% uncontested races in America is just a tragedy, right?
And then, from our study, so we just published last month our America Misrepresented report, where we took a look at every election in 2022 and 1 out of 10 elections had an impact of vote splitting, right? And so somebody that ended up leading with very slim margins, and folks wondering why, right? Like, how did this person get here? And so I'm happy to drop the link to that report for you all to check out. And we'll also be doing a virtual event to kind of do a deep dive next month about the American Misrepresented Report.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we'll drop that link in the chat. I'm sure Quinn can pull that for us right now. So that's great. And then, just kind of building off of that here, what's been the most effective teaching method for you all in talking about approval voting? If folks here are interested in it or interested in just explaining voter reform, to people, what's your elevator pitch that people can copy and use?
Yeah, so educating around approval voting isn't one size fits all. For those that are more kinetic, we actually have a poll. It's got Reality Star Sarah and Conspiracy Carl. You can kind of click all of the candidates that you approve of and kind of see what that outcome would look like. And so I can definitely drop the link there for that poll, but it's super, super easy to use. From our elections administrators. We kind of talk about the ease of implementation, the ease of tallying. And so our education is typically in person or virtual as we talk to kind of our elections directors in different counties. When it comes to our legislators, it's a mixed bag, right? Some of them are really interested in the research. Some of them want the talking points, right? And any of those landmine issues. And so on our website, we actually have an advocacy toolkits depending on who you're talking to. And the site is also designed for mixed learners. And so there's some areas that are only written up to like a 10th grade education or a second year in undergrad education, just because we want this to be 100% accessible. We want democracy to be accessible. For those that are more mechanists and mathematicians, we also have a very robust research hub that has white papers as well as poster presentations that kind of dig into the multiple layers that you'll end up seeing when you have the conversation around reform. And so we really kind of take folks where they are and take them on this journey that you can change the way in which you cast a ballot, and that there are avenues to have this implemented, should you desire to do so.
That's great. And then we had two related questions, so I'll just ask them both and you can riff off of them. So Local Lizard Lady in our Discord asks, how does Center for Election Science select the cities or regions it focuses on for electoral reform? What criteria do you use to say, here's where we're going to double down? And then Sal asked, what are the long-term goals for the Center for Election Science in terms of, national level electoral reform? Do you see a path for approval voting to be adopted more widely across the United States? So I guess kind of local, state, and then national. What's the roadmap here?
Fabulous question. So this has been, I think, where CES has really kind of gotten its teeth sharpened is determining where we put our very precious resources, both time, in-kind, financial resources, and what are those areas that might not be ready now, but we can educate, we can get them ready. And so a lot of it revolves around places that have ballot initiatives, places that have these pathways to enact legislation or enact the ability to allow for a pilot study, and being able to then take that data and have conversations with our legislators, with our delegates, with kind of coalition building with other nonprofits that are in the space. And so we're kind of doing that work really deep in Maryland. And so Maryland has legislation from many years ago that had actually approval voting, in the bill. We were able to secure a bill sponsor who is a Republican who ran his race in a consensus way, right? In a consensus builder, having coalitions that understand the need for reform, and then having support in the House, right? And lobbyists that get it, right? So it really is a perfect kind of storm. And so you'll be kind of seeing that as we continue our work in Maryland. We are also looking at Michigan, right? So Michigan had multiple elections that were, massively exciting. Women were running, but vote splitting was happening. We have a top 10 states that had been impacted by vote splitting. Arizona's on that list. New Hampshire's really high on that list. Maryland was on that list. And so for those areas that, really you kind of think about representation and the impacts that has, and we need to pull up, right? We need to have the conversation and get the reform moving. And then places like, previous to my time at CES, they were boots on the ground in Seattle, working to try to get approval voting implemented in Seattle, and then had to become on the defense because it's territory that is folks wanted to kind of fight over it. And so while approval voting, they got the signatures on the ballot, they ended up going with IRV over approval voting. And so sometimes those losses have really lasting impacts, but also it gives you a lot of, I think, skill to be able to move to the next one and be successful. And so while the reform conversation is cyclical and kind of, it is a very lengthy process to get any major legislation enacted, because we're doing innovation in a system that wasn't designed for it. We need a lot of people that's ready to kind of pull up the shields and take the mantle for us on the ground. And so we have a very active Discord channel. We've got, some state chapters as well that have worked really hard to even get, even some of the changes in policy that needs to happen. But there's a lot that kind of goes into just figuring out where we should go. One of the things we talked about Ohio, but Ohio just wasn't ready, right? And multiple things had to kind of align for it to get ready. From an organizational perspective, we're hyper focused in on, empirical research, getting more information related to voter expression and voter behavior, and helping take that research and moving it into practice. And so having conversations with our lobbyists, having conversations with our legislators, as well as their communication strategists and their campaign strategists, so that we can see better elections, better campaigns in the future. And then I think broadly, approval voting was used in 1291 when they had issues with electing a pope, right? A lot of associations use approval voting in their decision making. If you're looking for a date and time to meet with a group of 15 people, you're actually using approval voting on a doodle poll, right? And so it's used throughout. I was asked once, is it revolutionary enough? And when you're going from status quo to the first step, sometimes the simplicity of the change, the fact that it can work in the current system, but give you radical outcomes, right? Radical meaning a change, right? A reduction of some of these issues that have plagued democracy and that reduces trust in elections. That's worth trying, right? And so my hope and what I work really hard towards is giving folks the tools in order to educate themselves and the folks around them, and being able to advocate for this meaningful reform.
Yeah, well, so well said. And the doodle poll thing is so true. We do it.
Right?
Most people have done a poll or text or doodle or whatever, right? Like, when are we gonna meet? When are we gonna do whatever? Yep. So it's, that makes a lot of sense. It's like something you already know. It's just being applied in a context that, like, we're used to this other system that doesn't work very well. So yeah.
And increasingly so, right? So generation A will be the first, majority minority generation. And I just, I feel like for our generations that we need to start making that move towards what makes sense, right? For this particular group, for us, right? For the candidates in which we're running, the difference in our leadership, the financial implications, to be able to lead. And I take a look at some of the backgrounds of some of our elected officials, and the folks that have deep compassion came from nonprofits, the ones that really understand service for veterans, right? Not everyone's a Harvard, Yale graduate with being an attorney general, what have you. Some folks are just great leaders that are empathetic, that know about their communities and that care about their communities and can speak to issues because they've had to make very hard decisions for themselves and for their families, right? And so that lived experience counts a lot as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's a lot of the work that we do is we see people running, as independents, as nonpartisans tend to be those types of people, not the type of people who were, I was born to be a politician one day,
That's it.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I see a great question from Kiani, how to find out more info about Discord and the state chapters. We had a similar question from Simon on our Discord about how can I help bring approval voting to my town. So.
Yeah. So I dropped in the chat the link to the Discord. There's a general chat that's always popping, but then there's segments based on your region. And then on the electionscience.org website, we'd love for you to sign up for the newsletter so that you're able to get all of the great information related to the events that we have. Sometimes we host folks that we find particularly interesting in the election space. So it's not always about voting reform. We have another presentation, I believe next week on the 27th, where we talk about communication around mistrust in elections and what not only elected officials, legislators, and nonprofits can do to help talk about that, but like what's the next step, right? And we lean into the professionalization as well of democracy reform. And so being able to also highlight that these jobs exist. So for different ways for folks to get involved should they want to.
Yeah, we had a question from Cam about how do people get involved with the research side if they're interested in that.
Yeah, so on electionscience.org, if you click Research Hub, that is your place. And if you scroll to the bottom of that, you can add in your information or a proposal that you might be interested in collaborating with us on. But we'll have, or if you have research yourself that you've done that you want to be included in our resource library, we love doing that. And so you'll be able to reach out to our research team, have a call. And then of course, I would encourage everyone to join our Discord as well, to kind of really talk about not only how to enact this and what to do in practice and advocate, but if you're really interested in learning deeply about the other reforms and the methods, it's a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, no, I find a lot of folks who are more data oriented tend to find themselves in this how do we do voting reform space because it comes down to some math and so, right, statistics, and that's where I think you guys have kind of taken the lead, right, of being the very data driven group. Two more questions for you, Nina, as we come to the end. Unless folks have more questions, please put them in the chat if you do so we can add those in. Sal asked, how do you all work with local governments and communities to ensure the smooth implementation of approval voting after it's been passed? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so we're kind of seeing that in Missouri, where you have some legislators that the language in which they use isn't as intentional, right? And so if they have a problem with RCV, they write it in a way that would then put up barriers for things like start voting, approval voting, or what have you. And so not only do we work with kind of our coalition, like folks on the ground, we make sure that the areas in which approval voting has been implemented is protected. And so it happened in St. Louis where, the folks came in, tried to, kind of change back to plurality voting, and then it went back to the voters. The voters voted to protect approval voting, right? And so
what was the margin on that? I'm curious, how did that go?
It was actually pretty impactful. I think it was in the 70%.
Wow. So 70% said, no, we want to keep this bug off, basically, to the people who were trying to take it out.
Get out of here with trying to get rid of it, right? And so what's really great about that work is that they're now looking at expanding it into other municipalities to be able to use and adopt. Part of, I like the word hurdles, I've seen it multiple times, is, having data related to it in practice, right? And so in those areas where we've not been able to penetrate yet, being able to get a pilot study going especially in those particularly innovative states like Utah, to be able to gather some of that data. But we're always very watchful, having very strong conversations and relationships with our sponsors and our supporters. So I'm talking regularly to our bill champions and our bill sponsors and keeping them up to date with what's going on, but also creating that feedback loop. Like, where are the holes that we might end up seeing if I go testify in front of Senate, right? And so, who am I actually, testifying in front of? Like, have they heard of RCV and nothing else? Have they heard of approval voting? Like, and so it really is a constant temperature check. But that also speaks to the work that we do. Democracy is never done, right? And so we're constantly jumping the next curve, we're constantly iterating. If you are a big fan of design thinking, this is that work, right? And so it's just this constant loop. And I really like the offensive side of this work, but man, defense can get really cool too. So, so yeah, it's really exciting work.
That's awesome. Well, I think, on that note, the last question I'd love to ask kind of brings us back around to the beginning from Sal. What motivated you to make this shift into focusing on election science and voter education and these reforms? As you mentioned, you came from healthcare, right? Originally a totally different industry, but why did you come to really care so deeply about this and put your time in, at this level of involvement?
So I've had the pleasure of working in a nonpartisan capacity my entire career. And so whether it was H1N1 under the Bush administration or, Ebola under the Obama administration, I was able to kind of see this thread between the administrations of, do as much good for as many as you can for as long as you can, right? And so that was always super, super impactful when it comes to healthcare. There was always a ton of work that needed to be doing in terms of advocacy, whether it was early work with the Sunshine Act or even with appropriations committees through the CDC. Like, there was always something to do. And I started to change my mind and my tune in the Trump administration. And so the first thing that I worked on was actually the travel ban. And so the travel ban was issued right around resident matching. And we were getting physicians from those banned countries that were being matched to rural areas that really needed those doctors, right? And so it was immediately working on coalitions throughout the other medical specialty societies to then, plead our case and advocate for those physicians and really broadly the American public to be able to have what we needed, right? And so it was sometimes short-sighted decisions, and then the impacts of that. And so it changed my mind. It's like politics is kind of where I needed to be and where I felt most useful as a leader that had been known as being someone particularly divergent in her thinking, but also I'm not scared to jump that next curve, right? I'm not scared to figure out what democracy 2.0 looks like. 2.0 light year, right? And so I'm not scared about that. And I do think that this is an area that is in dire need of innovation, right? And this is a area that is in dire need of diverse representation, right? And so, I've been able to see in my lifetime legislators that look like me, but everyone can't say that yet, right? And so, it's time to, I think, start moving the needle on what that American dream looks like. Is it attainable right now, right? And if it's not, how can we make some big changes? And so, while I made a massive career change, that's those skills in terms of my leadership, how to figure things out and move that chain, down the field is kind of the work that I do. And so, and then of course I'm a researcher at heart. My first job was at the United States Department of Agriculture and in the lab. And so when it comes to data and just trying to figure out what are these lessons that we're learning out of not only the data, but true experience to be able to get to where we need to be as a democracy where everyone feels included and that their voice and their vote matters. is just work that I go to sleep really happy at night, right? So because I know there is more to be done, but we're on our way, right? And so I'm happy that the folks at Good Party, you're doing the work that you're doing, that there are people that are going to hang on a phone call at 7 o'clock to talk about this, and that are jacked up and ready to go and make a difference. Like this is democracy at work, and most importantly, democracy in action.
Yes, I love that. That's really powerful. Your journey. Thank you for sharing that, and putting yourself in the ring, to work on this explicitly. And I think speaking from our movement, where we're doing the work of getting independents, alternative parties, nonpartisan candidates up the curve, and running and winning elections. Voting reforms like approval voting, and just any innovation that we can get passed on the
Yeah,
way
for
that we vote is just so essential for the ongoing success of our movement and our work to change the two-party system in politics. So just thank you so much for the work that you're doing. As a St. Louis, I went to high school in St. Louis, family in St. Louis, so grateful for the work there too. And and thank you for, of course, speaking with us and sharing the download, the data, bringing that data for approval
No
voting.
problem. No problem. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody, for hanging on. Please check us out at electionscience.org. If you have that activism bug, or if you are wanting to campaign and you want more information, we always make time. We always have time for this discussion. So please reach out and get connected, and share approval voting with someone that you're close to, right? And so while we encourage people to vote, because sitting out is just not an option anymore, there are pathways to getting involved in reform, and your voice is valuable. So we love your time as well.
Yay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nina. Thank you everyone for tuning in and watching and listening, and we'll keep doing these. So if you're not already following us on social or on our email list, goodparty.org, you can hear about upcoming AMAs with democracy reform leaders, and get to know this amazing space that most Americans don't know exists, right? That there are amazing humans doing really hard work in every single state in this country to make our democracy better. Nina being a fabulous example of that. And so, please stay tuned for more of these conversations, so you can really see and feel the amazing innovation and reform that's happening and is so critical. So thank you.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Bye.
Nina. Thanks, everybody.